All right, as you guys know, we've got to start with a sip of cold sweet tea.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've been following the channel for a little while, you'll know about this engine. This is Dorothy and Daryl's Skunkworks 107 Touring build. And again, if you look back at previous videos, you'll see the entire build process from the teardown, piece by piece, from top to bottom. You would see us splitting the cases, the sumping issues that they had, the problems with the crank run out. You would have seen the machining process and us doing the Timken bearing conversion in this case. You would have seen us putting the case together. And in the last episode, we put the gear drive cam chest together. In today's video, we're going to finish building this bad boy. I'm going to show you how to do cylinders, set the rings. We're going to put the heads on it. I'm going to show you how to measure deck height and all that type of stuff to make sure this thing goes together like it should be. So grab yourself something cold to drink and have a seat. This one's going to be a long one. All right, here in a couple of seconds, we're going to make the move, and I'm going to put the camera on my head since you guys like to see that close-up perspective and what I'm actually doing with my hands and the tools that I'm using. Of course, we got this really cool stand that we got from Jim's, and you're going to see some tools along the way from Jim's USA that I would highly recommend. Also, check out the sweatshirt. This is the older design. We should have our new design popping up on our Teespring store, which brings me to this. I'm going to put a link in the description where you can go to Teespring, because when you purchase these shirts, a portion of the profits of that goes to our charity, 3T Sports, which is you guys buying shirts enabled us to do the All Kids Bike program, which is pretty exciting. I put a little bit of information about that up on the community tab on the page if you want to read a little more about it. And the plan is for us to have a bike build-off here at the shop. We're going to have 25 bicycles coming in that are designed to get kindergarten through first, second grade kids on more bikes. It's an entire curriculum that we're putting in place at a local elementary school. So we're going to have an event here at the shop. There'll be a limited number of people just because of this space and constraints that we have. But we're going to have food and music. Law Tigers is going to help us out with that. And of course, you know, we've got to give a big thanks to Brian Clock at Clockworks for playing his role, and a big thanks to you guys for donating during the chat with Brian, and then also buying, you know, shirts and things from our Teespring store. All of that goes to help these kids and get these programs in Georgia get more kids on bikes. That's pretty awesome. All right, so the first step, there's several things I've already done along the way here to get us to this point. One of the first things, we've already done the heads, of course. They were CNC ported valves, valve job springs, all of that. Our members got to see a behind-the-scenes view on us actually doing all that machine work on the heads and how all of that goes together. It's an unedited video, and everyone just got to see exactly how we do those things. So we've got the heads done. We have already bored to hone the cylinders. We went to a 3937 bore on the stock cylinders, and so that portion has already been done. I've already cleaned the cylinders. We're going to go through and do a final cleaning on them, and I'm going to show you a good way to do that. One of the first steps with it, it's always a good idea to use a bit of a degreaser, if you will, like a Dawn dishwashing detergent, and a soft bristle brush, and really scrub the inside of those cylinders, again with a soft bristle brush, to get any type of particulate out of that bore and get those good and clean. Now, of course, the second that they come out of the sink, you want to be sure, blow them dry and put a light film of oil on them, of course, so they don't rust. But then there's a second step before we do the actual installation. A couple other things we're going to do. I'm going to show you how to measure deck height, how to test fit stuff as part of the process, and how to choose head gaskets, what some of these measurements mean, and all that type of stuff. Another thing we've already done, we've chased all of the holes that bolts will be going into inside the rocker boxes and everything else. Get all the old Loctite and trash out of it, and of course cleaned all of those holes. All of the bolts we've put on a wire wheel to clean any old residual Loctite out of them. They've also been cleaned with acetone. I like acetone because it evaporates quickly. You can use MEK, methyl ethyl ketone, you know, some type of solvent that will evaporate, not leave an oil film. After you clean those threads, you want to make sure to use a chemical solvent like that will strip all of the oil off of the fasteners, so that when you put your Loctite on it, you know that the Loctite's going to adhere to that fastener and hold it in place as it should. So I think we're ready, guys. Let's get started. So check this water bottle out, the coldest water, and I've been really surprised at this thing, man. It keeps beverages cold. I put some tea in it this morning, and it's still
It's still pretty cold. Pretty amazing, actually. They're pretty good price. These guys actually gave me a discount code so for the coldest water. So in the description, I'm going to put a discount code for you guys in case you decided you wanted to get one of these. Pretty nice, pretty nice. All right, so let's get started with the wrist pin bushings. I'm going to be walking back and forth from the table here a few times. We're going to start with our wrist pin bushings. Now, one of the things we want to do is feel along the edge here and make sure we don't have any burrs. We don't want to scar that bushing inside there, that wrist pin bushing. And if you do have a burr on there, like right there, if it doesn't come right off with your fingernail, then you can take a light Scotch-Brite pad and deburr that right there. I wouldn't put anything aggressive on it, like a knife edge or anything. But we want to check the fitment in there. And I understand you guys aren't going to have bore gauges for this type of thing that I'm going to have. So I'll tell you what it's supposed to feel like and show you. We want to do this dry. We have got a good idea of what it feels like. And just like anything else, don't force it in there. We talked about that when we were doing the gear drive. Try to use microfibers when you can. They won't leave lint behind. So we want to do this dry and just slide it in there. Don't force it in. If it doesn't want to go, then you need to stop. All right. So you can see we've got it really nice here. Basically no friction, what I would call slip fit, no shake. In machinist world, slip fit, no shake is roughly about a 2/1000 clearance that's in there, but real light, rotates smoothly all the way around. We want to feel for that. If it's sticking in one area, it could be because you got a connecting rod issue or the pin itself. But it should not have any movement. Left to right, top up and down, check that. Should be nice and tight. So again, slip fit, no shake. I'm going to check it against the rear one just to see, and then I'll check the other pin as well. You can see our fitment is exactly the same. Very light pressure to put it through there dry. We're in good shape. I'm going to check the other pin, again, just so I don't have to mark them front and rear. If it feels exactly the same, it does, no shake. Perfect. And let's check this one. And as expected, it's perfect. Rotates nice and easily. We'll set those to the side. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to check deck height. All right, so if we think about how this entire engine went together, all of the components and all the machining processes building up to here is what's going to determine our piston placement within the cylinder. And that's of course also going combination with a head gasket is going to determine what our piston to head clearance is. I'll get to that, more of that here in a minute. So what we're dealing with here, this is a combination of the accuracy of the connecting rod, the crank, you know, from center line of the crank up to the top of the rod. We're also dealing with the height of the engine case. If you watch our video series I did on engine blueprinting, you'll see what that involves. So I've already mocked this one up, checked it. That way we could do all of our machining to the cylinders and such to get it exactly where I want it. Now my goal for this engine, because of the compression ratio and this type of build, I want basically a 35/1000 quench. So that's and what will happen is when we put the piston on, we're going to slide the cylinder on without a base gasket and without an O-ring. We want that cylinder to sit completely flush to the case. The other thing we've done is you'll notice few little fly cut marks on here on this case, something you didn't see. It was kind of a behind the scenes deal. We did machine this case completely flat to make sure it was flat here. We did the same thing with the cylinder. We just took a little bit off of it to make sure both of those surfaces are completely flat. All right, so we're going to start again. No rings on the pistons, no gasket, no O-ring on the bottom of the cylinder, and we're just going to slide that together. Now it is pretty critical. You want to make sure to protect that piston from the studs. It can nick it. So we're going to start with the front cylinder. You'll notice here each of these cylinders, the other step of the process I've already done, I've already gapped the rings as well. You'll notice I wrote the gap on top of the pistons. You'll see that in a minute. And when I gap the rings, I always note front and rear. Same with the piston, same with the ring. So everything is a perfect, precise fit when we go back together. So we're going to be starting on the front cylinder. I want to make sure, as you can see there, I've marked this set of rings. I've already gapped, F for front, and this piston, obviously, for the front. I've already cleaned everything off here. Now, these are our custom designed pistons. They're very unique. for several reasons. Number one, we are running an offset wrist pin. The wrist pin is pushed toward the thrust face of the piston a little bit, which helps reduce wear on the thrust face of the piston. All right. The other thing, you'll notice the crown is hard anodized, and we also have them made and to where you can anodize into the top ring land in there, and that just helps from degradation over time and keeps the ring in there tight. All right. You'll also notice this coating. This is a very special abradable skirt coating. So this coating is formulated to a particular surface pressure, and this allows us to fit this piston into the bore at 8/10 or at 1/2 to 8/10 of a thousandth. So what that does is when we put this thing together, the piston is going to seem very tight inside the bore. It should be, because within the first couple of minutes of running, before this material cures, it's going to clearance and then have a perfect clearance inside the bore, which is going to reduce any piston rock. If we can reduce piston rock, then we can keep the ring square against the cylinder, nice sharp edge there, square inside the land there, and that's going to, of course, promote ring seal over the life of the engine. Now, I'll tell you another thing I've done here. You'll notice here, of course, these are my gaps I'm running on this one, 19 thousandths on the top ring, 16 thousandths on the second ring, which is recommended for that particular type of ring that we're running and the bore size. You'll also notice I've written numbers down. I like to write the numbers down on here and mark them so that it's a very easy reference for me when I put the piston rings on and can line those rings up perfectly, right up to the point I slide the cylinder on there. So it's a real quick visual reference. Now, one interesting thing about piston rings, yes, it's critically important that they're lined up properly when you assemble the engine, but a lot of people don't know, and inexperienced engine builders, if they slide a cylinder off of an engine and they see the rings lined up or the rings move, they kind of freak out. Well, rings are supposed to move and rotate inside the bore during the life of the engine. One of those clearances that are very important when you design a piston is called radial wall clearance. And that has to do with how the ring fits inside the piston and that clearance there along with the gap. So that radial wall clearance is very important to ensure that the rings do rotate during the life of the engine. If they did not rotate during the life of the engine, anywhere you have a ring gap, it would wear a groove into the cylinder or not wear that portion of the cylinder. So it's important that the rings move. So if you happen to disassemble an engine, I would say before you disassemble the engine, always do a leak down and cylinder pressure test. If your cylinder pressure is good and you pull the cylinder off and you realize, hey, all the rings are lined up, that's a problem. That doesn't mean it's a problem. It just means that that's where they fell. That's not unusual, and as long as your cylinder pressure is where it's supposed to be, it's not a concern at all. So don't freak out if you pull an engine apart and you see the rings have moved. It doesn't mean it's a problem. That's just another thing. So let's keep moving. So we've got the front. I have already put one of the spiral locks inside here, and a lot of people have problems with the spiral locks. I find them quite easy to use and much easier to use than the spring-loaded C-clips. There's another reason I'm not a fan of the C-clips and why I designed the pistons with this type of lock. Remember how fast this piston moves in the bore. You know, at max RPM, you can be going 4,000 to 5,000 plus, and over that on long stroke stuff, feet per minute. Well, those clips are relatively heavy. So when you get down to the bottom of the stroke, I actually have disassembled engines that run those type of clips, and you can see on the bottom down here, or even on the top, where that clip has beat up the inside of that bore in there. And it sounds crazy, guys. It doesn't seem like it's that much, but you got to remember the rotational weight and the impact of this piston coming down and then back up, down and up. Those springs can actually bounce a little bit inside there, and at some point, if they wear enough, it is possible that they bounce out. Now, there are millions of pistons out there that have those clips, but there's also millions of pistons that have these. And when you run these spiral locks that are spring-loaded in there, multiple strand, and then each strand weighs less, it's less likely to have that vibration of the spring clip. So that's why I use these. Once I show you how to install them, you will see how much easier that they are to deal with. Now, the other thing with the piston, of course, anytime you're doing it, you've got the large valve relief here. Of course, your intake valve is larger. So it's pretty easy to see when you have like this, which is going to be the front, and of course, that's going to be intake valve. But when you're running a piston that is using an offset wrist pin, using an offset wrist pin like this, it could be that your piston has the same size valve release for front and rear, but if the direction that the piston goes in the engine is critically important. Now, when we design these, of course, we show this as the front piston with an arrow facing forward. So there's kind of no question there, but the wrist pin is also offset toward the rear, which means that this is going to be the front. So pay close attention to those markings. Don't always assume the larger valve relief is going to go toward the intake. If you're running offset wrist pins, that's not the case. I've seen people, same size valve release, put the pistons in backwards, and that will wear, it's just a matter of a few hundred miles, this face of the piston. So you want to be sure you don't do that. Now, let's roll with it. Again, I'm assembling this portion dry because I want to feel the clearances with everything. I should have a nice fit here. Rotates nice. So again, slip fit, no shake, and it's completely dry. Again, don't force it. You'll find the right spot. Just give it a little wiggle, little shake. Everything should slide right into place. All right. Now let's slide the cylinder on. Before I slide the cylinder on, I want to show you how I like to do that final step of cleaning. I'm not used to working on these tables. I'm used to my build table, but this will work regardless. All right, I like to do this with a lint-free paper towel. You notice it has little ribs in it to help grab some dirt there. And let's soak it with a little bit of oil. Now remember, I've already taken this cylinder and I have already scrubbed it down with Dawn dishwashing detergent in a sink, scrubbed it really well, rinsed it, put a light film of oil on it, and yet look what we get on the rack. Now that was, again, completely clean. And we want to keep repeating this process until there is nothing on this white paper towel. And there we go. Nice and clean. Sweet tea?
Yeah.
And what you can do, again, be gentle with this type of stuff, guys. Notice the threads on the stud here. You know, that can nick the top of the piston, nick that area right there. But you've only got two hands and you need to pick up your cylinder. If you rotate that carefully and lay it softly here, you're not hitting the threads, so it's not a big deal. All right. I always like just to rotate it through, see what it feels like. Everything's nice, but you'll also notice, I want to show you this. I'd mentioned about the skirt coating and the tolerance that we're fitting this piston. Notice there is zero rock in this piston, and that's exactly what we want to see, because again, that coating, the first few minutes it runs, it's going to wear just enough to ensure that that's there and not cause you any issues. So that's perfect. Let's take a couple of our hold downs here. I like these. This is another great tool that Jim's makes. Like I said, I prefer to do this. You do this without the rings. That way, no resistance or anything on the piston. And no O-ring on the bottom. So we know it is secured and completely flat against the case. So I'd also mentioned to you that we had machined the bottom of the cylinder slightly and machined the case to make sure it was completely flat. So we can walk around here and do a visual. Yes, I could get a feeler gauge and slide it in there, but I can look at it and tell we're completely flush and flat all the way around. But we're in good shape there. Let's rotate this around and see where we're at. Part of my challenge with doing these videos is trying to figure out, you know, some of you guys are do-it-yourselfers. So what I try to do, yes, I have fixtures to do this type of thing, but what I try to do is figure out the tools that you guys may have easy access to. Some of the tools I even use during build processes are things that I've made. But in this, you know, what I'm using here is something, again, I think that you guys may have access to, or something you could pick up at a Harbor Freight or something. And what this is just a vice grip base that you would use to, say, check ball joints on a car. And you can see I've just vice gripped it to the stud over here just to hold a stationary location. And then I have a steel bar that I know is flat. You know, we're not necessarily checking one clearance compared to another, we're checking a movement. So as long as nothing moves, you hold that bar on the piston and then zero everything out, then we can see exactly where we are. Makes it nice and simple. So if I rotate the crank through, I've got the piston below deck. As I bring the piston up, I'm just measuring how much that piston moves above the deck. And I'm actually right at 10 thousandths of an inch, which makes sense because we've got a little tolerance in the piston. I know I took a few thousandths off the bottom of the cylinder and the top of the case. So we are right at 10 thousandths. Actually, we are at 9 thousandths. Let me back that up. All right, so in an ideal world for engine design, you want your piston to be as close to 30 thousandths without going under as you can get it to the head. All right, so that's called your quench. The quench area around the perimeter of the piston here, and also the quench area on the head here, which the piston comes into this area right there on the head. All right, so that clearance ideally would be 30 thousandths between the head and the piston. All right, now the way I've designed this engine, I want it to be between 30 and 35 thousandths after doing all the machine work on the cases in the bottom of the cylinder. I want it to be 30 to 35 thousandths. Since we're not running a base gasket, we do not have to factor in the thickness of the base gasket. If we had bored these cases for, say, a 117 or a 124 or something like that, then you would have to add in that clearance, because you would then be sliding a gasket under this, which would move the cylinder up, moving the piston further down in the bore. But since we fitted it without a gasket, and this engine will not be running a gasket, we don't have to worry about that. We're good. So what we have right now is the piston is 10 thousandths above deck, meaning the piston is 10 thousandths above the cylinder here. All right, so if I want a 30 thousandths, a perfect 30 thousandths, excuse me, I was at 9 thousandths. So my goal is to get that 30 thousandths quench between the piston and the head. So if I want that 30 thousandths and we're 9 thou proud outside the hole, if I were to use a 30 thousandths head gasket, then because the piston protrudes 9 thousandths, we would only have a 21 thousandths quench. That's not enough. But if we use a 40 thou head gasket and we subtract the 9 thousandths that the piston is proud, that gives us 31 thousandths, and that is perfect and exactly what we're looking for. All right, I hope that makes sense. Now let's move to the rear. And if our machining was perfect, we should have 9 thousandths on this cylinder too. And we have 8 thousandths, only 1 thousandths difference from one to the other despite all that machine work. I'm very, very happy with that. So let's review the math one more time. It'll make sense for everybody. So again, we have 8 thousandths positive deck, which means the piston is above the deck of the cylinder. So we have 8 thousandths proud or 8 thousandths positive. We know I'm using a 40 thousandths head gasket on that one. If we use a 40 thousandths head gasket on this one, then that will give us a 32 thousandths. You just subtract. That'll give us a 32 thousandths deck. And we are perfect.